We live in dark times. I bet you've heard that at least once or twice in the last, 24 hours. And we live in dark times, but if you went back 10 years, people would tell you, we're living in dark times. 50 years ago, we're living in dark times, and you can go back and back and back. We always live in dark times because the world around us is dark. It's filled with things which draw us away from the love of God, draw us away from the love of one another. And when we do not have that, things seem pretty bad. In this morning's gospel, Jesus is speaking to the disciples, those who are closest to him. And he starts to teach. He said, "You are the salt of the earth. And if salt loses its saltiness, it's not good for much of anything, and it's cast out on the ground." Now, you and I know a little bit about salt. We know that if you add the right amount to a food, it makes it taste better. Too little, it can be bland, and too much, it's pretty much inedible. But we know how to balance that. We know how that savor works with the salt and how it is wonderfully satisfying. The salt that Jesus was speaking to the disciples about was something which is absolutely essential to them. First of all, they didn't have little boxes of Morton's salt that they kept in their pantry. They had to go out and they had to find it. And most of the time it came from taking salt water, which they had plenty of, and just allowing it to evaporate and collect the salt off of that. Now, it was fairly insubstantial when you do that, so they'd mix it with other things, quite often lime, so that they could extend it. Because what they would do is they would take that salt and put it on meat and fish and other things to dry it and to keep it from rotting. It was a way of preserving it. It was also used for the purification of things. It was used in many different ways. But it could actually lose its savor. It could lose its saltiness, because as the lime and the other things went away and dissolved, you didn't have much salt left. And so it wasn't a strange thing for them. We think of salt as always salt. You can keep it in the pantry forever, and it's always going to have that salty taste. It was not so for them. So he's saying, you are the salt of the earth. You lend savor. You prevent corruption. You allow things to be maintained. It's part of who you are. And it's interesting because he doesn't say you're like salt of the earth. This isn't a parable. This is telling them you are the salt of the earth. It starts to sound a bit like a commission, like a sending out on a ministry. And he immediately turns around and said, you are the light of the world. Again, not you are like the light of the world, you are the light of the world. And no one takes light and puts it under a bushel, but rather it puts it in the middle of the room so that its light might penetrate the house. Just a little bit of light can make all the difference. When Jonathan was growing up, he loved Legos. I hated Legos because in the middle of the night I would get up and I would walk across the house, perhaps to go let the dog out, to go check on Jonathan, and one of those little 4x4 squares of Lego would be in the middle of the floor, and I would step on it. And all kinds of ungodly things might come out of my mouth. And then the cell phone came along with that little light. And rather than turning on lights throughout the house, I'd push a button and this little light would shine. And there I could see that Lego. A little bit of light illumines the whole room. And he said, you are the light of the world. You bring light into this darkness. And we hear this echoed in the reading from Isaiah this morning. Isaiah is talking about all the things that they're doing, the fasts and the setting themselves apart and showing how wonderful they are. And he says, this is not what the fast is supposed to be. That does not please God. But rather, when you go out and you care for those in the greatest need, you supply for those who are naked, you do things which show forth compassion and love, then you're getting somewhere. That's the light that Jesus is talking about to his disciples. That light that shines into that darkness. Simply doing things for the sake of doing things and saying that we're doing it in a holy way doesn't get much done. Jesus continues on after that. And he says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law, but rather I have come to fulfill it." The law was given to Israel as a way in which they could maintain their relationship with God, in a way in which they could say, if we do these things, we don't get too far off track. Paul called it a custodian. Some people refer to it as guardrails that keep us in the right relationship with God by what we do. But we all know that laws can be broken. And we all know that we can take laws and work them in and out so that we can find our way around them. Just ask anybody who drives 5 miles or 10 miles over the speed limit. We're breaking the law. We find a way to nuance that for our own benefit. And after he's talked about that, he immediately turns and takes to the Pharisees. And he says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees, you will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. The Pharisees were lawyers. And when you bring lawyers in, things get complicated. Apologies to any of you out here who are attorneys. But they come in and they find the nuances and the thickets of the law. And they find ways, one, to allow themselves to exceed the law in some way, shape, or form, and then hold that same law over the head of the children of Israel for their own benefit. They're righteous. They follow the law. They know it inside and out, and they do those things which they really think they should be doing. But the law was not meant for that. It was meant to draw people into relationship with God. And the righteousness of the Pharisees is centered on their own goodness, on who they are. So how does our righteousness exceed that of the Pharisees? Go all the way back to the beginning of the gospel and talk about being salt and light. You are the light of the world. You are the salt of the earth. You are the ones who go out into this world, and you lend that savor to this life because you know Jesus Christ. You go out to coffee with a friend. You gather for a meal with relatives. You go and you sit there in that place, and you start to hear about how dark the world is, how difficult things are, all the challenges, the difficulties in relationships, and all those things. Well, you have a light that can shine into that. You can add savor to that conversation by bringing in the knowledge of what God has done with you. Now, of course, that requires us to be converted. It requires us to know Christ, to taste and know that he is light and life and salt and all those things for us. He's what gives us our existence and our flavor. And then we start to inject that into the things that we do in daily living, in daily life. We're not sitting there telling them, thou shalt not, but rather we're showing them the glory of God by the way we live. That's what we hear in Isaiah, talking about how we care for those around us, how we show forth the glory of God, and that is what he desires of us, not just simply fasting for the sake of fasting. We have a ministry, a vocation, a commission to go into this world and be the disciples of Christ, and to take upon ourselves that ministry of being salt and light in this world, to allow people to see the grace of God working in us. The world longs for what we have. The world desires to know what we know, Jesus Christ. One of my pastimes is to read sermons from various preachers, from most of them from quite a while ago, reading the sermons of the early church fathers. But there's one who's much more contemporary. His name is Charles Spurgeon. Charles Spurgeon is a great Baptist preacher. Now, he may be a Baptist, but he preaches like a patristic scholar. He has wonderful prose, and he is almost poetic in the way that he preaches. And on this text, in his sermon, he says, poor world, it is dark. It is groping around at midnight, and it cannot get light except it find us in us. Amen.